In 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act gave education its first uniform definition of an evidence-based intervention or an evidence-based practice. In this video, I'm going to break that definition down for you and help you understand how, as a local or school level decision maker, you can use this definition to make better evidence-informed decisions in your classrooms. Hi friends, I'm Matthew Courtney and I help schools help kids. And on this channel, we talk all about evidence-informed school improvement. So if you're into that, hit subscribe and come be a part of our community of improvers. All right, let's get right into it. What you see here on the screen is the definition of an evidence-based intervention, copy and pasted directly out of the Every Student Succeeds Act. You can see here that there are 4 levels of evidence, or sometimes called tiers of evidence, within this definition. Strong evidence, moderate evidence, promising evidence, and evidence that demonstrates a rationale. Now, it's important to understand that this is not everything that the federal law has to say about evidence-based practices. And that's because after the passage of the ESSA, the U.S. Department of Education promulgated regulations where they expanded upon this definition and gave us a little more nuance to work with. As we go through the rest of this video, I'm going to merge together the information from the ESSA and the information from the Code of Federal Regulations to help you get a full picture of each of these 4 levels. Now, we're going to start our conversation at level 4, evidence that demonstrates a rationale, and we're going to work our way up from there. Here you see the definition of evidence that demonstrates a rationale. First, it must be suited around a well-specified logic model. This means that a researcher or an evidence-informed leader in a school or a district has taken in all the evidence that they can find and synthesized it together to create a logic model that suggests that the intervention is going to be effective on their population. We also want to see that relevant research or evidence suggests that the intervention is likely to improve the desired outcome. And so this means that we haven't necessarily studied this intervention on a group of kids directly yet, but we're pretty sure, based on the logic model that we've created, that it is likely to improve outcomes. And finally, if you are implementing an intervention at this level 4 demonstrates a rationale tier, then there's an expectation that you are studying that intervention along the way, that you are systematically collecting that data, you're bringing that into your school, you're taking that data into your decision-making process, and if you're successful, you're sharing that success with the world, and if you're unsuccessful, you're going to put that intervention away and try something new. Now, I like to think about this tier as being our innovation tier. This is where we get to take evidence, merge it together, and create something new. It's a really important space for us to be in education, especially in this sort of post-COVID school improvement environment where our kids are different, our schools are different, and our society is different. We have to be able to develop the skills to synthesize evidence together and create new innovations in our schools. And that is what this tier allows us to do. Now, there's a lot of confusion when I talk to schools and districts about this tier because many people think that since it's tier 4, it's a less rigorous design style, that we just should ignore it altogether, that we don't want to do low rigorous evidence in our school. And that's really not a very healthy way to think about this evidence tier. What we really need to be thinking about when we're working in this tier is, are we innovating? Hopefully we are. And if we're innovating, are we systematically collecting the data in an academically rigorous way so that we can prove that our innovation works and continue doing it, or that it doesn't work and we're going to stop doing it? If you don't have capacity to do that within your school, this is a great opportunity to engage in a research practice partnership with your local university or with national groups like Regional Education Laboratories or American Institutes for Research who assist schools in program evaluation in real time. As we move up in rigor, we move into promising evidence or level 3 evidence. A piece of evidence is considered promising evidence if it is a correlational study that shows a statistically significant and positive or favorable effect on our desired outcome. It's really important when thinking about these levels that we're looking at research that is not overridden by more recent or more rigorous research. So a correlational study from 2023 that has been overridden by a more rigorous research, maybe a level 2 or a level 1 study in 2007, might not meet the definition of an evidence-based practice under the Every Student Succeeds Act. The ESSA also wants to see that we're using evidence that includes a large and multi-site sample that overlaps with your population. I always abbreviate this part to say that when we're selecting evidence, we want to always try to select evidence that was created with kids like ours in schools like ours. That overlap between sample demographics, sample size, and setting is so important. If you're in a rural setting, you should be starting your evidence review by looking at evidence that was collected in other rural settings. That's not to say that evidence collected in an urban setting won't help you and won't inform your decision, but we have to remember that children in urban settings are different thinkers. They have different lifestyles. They have different environments than children who are being raised in rural settings. And so that demographic variable is really important. As long as we remember, we always want to work with evidence that was collected on kids like ours in schools like ours. Okay, let's take it up another level of rigor and look at Tier 2. Here we have ESSA's definition of moderate evidence, or Tier 2 or Level 2 evidence. A piece of evidence is considered moderate evidence if it's based on a quasi-experimental study design. And what this means is we have two groups of previously assigned kids, like classrooms or schools, and groups on one side get some kind of intervention, and groups on the other side don't get the intervention. And at the end of the year, we do some fancy math to see which group did better. At this tier, we also introduce an expectation that evidence meets the What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards with or without reservations. If you're unfamiliar with the What Works Clearinghouse, it's a federal database in which a team of staff and volunteers perform systematic reviews to help evidence-informed educators make better decisions about practices, curriculums, and programs in their school. There's another video on my channel about the What Works Clearinghouse. I'll link it down below in the description if that's something that you're interested in. The thing you need to know about What Works Clearinghouse for this video is that they have an evidence standards document. And so there's an expectation from the U.S. Department of Education that educators are looking and comparing the evidence that they're using in their schools with that evidence standards document. It's a pretty heavy read if you're not comfortable already with research fluency and statistical analysis. So my advice to schools here is always just do your best and make a best effort when trying to decide if a piece of evidence meets this rigorous threshold. Okay, back to our definition here. We see again that moderate evidence must show a statistically significant and positive or favorable effect on whatever our selected outcome is. We again see that it is not overridden by more or recent or more rigorous research, and we see that it includes a large and multi-site sample that overlaps with your population, kids like ours and schools like ours. I often get questions from evidence-informed educators about what the law means when it says a large and multi-site sample. So let's pause here and break that down a little bit. The Code of Federal Regulations defines a large sample as 250 or more study participants. So as you're going through your literature, we really want to see that we're selecting research that it has a large sample size, more than 250, more than 1,000. Generally speaking, the more people we have participating in our study, the larger our analytic sample is, the better or higher quality the information we have when we make our decision. Now, that's not to say that studies with small populations are not useful to you. Allow that information to synthesize with the rest of the research that you found as you make the best decision possible for your school and your kids. A multi-site sample is a little more straightforward. We want to see that the research was conducted in multiple locations. That could be multiple schools, multiple school districts, cities, municipalities, states, counties, however you choose to define that. The researcher will almost always explain how their sample was collected and the boundaries of that sample within the methods section of their research paper. Okay, now we've arrived back at the top of the evidence-based practice definition with Tier 1 strong evidence. A piece of evidence is considered to be strong evidence if it is based on an experimental study design, also frequently called a randomized controlled trial. In this type of study, a researcher takes all of their kids, puts them in a hat, and randomly sorts them into two groups, an intervention group and a control group. And at the end of the study, they do fancy math to see which group of kids performed better. We again see here at this tier that there's an expectation that we meet the What Works Clearinghouse evidence standards, this time without reservations. This is a very narrow parameter that most educators are going to really struggle with because it is hyper technical. So again, here I say, do your best, review those evidence standards to the best of your ability, and make your best judgment. We again want to see that it shows a statistically significant and positive or favorable result, that it's not overridden by more recent or more rigorous research, And again, it includes a large and multi-site sample conducted in schools like ours with kids like ours. So when we get up to this tier of evidence, it's really all about that randomized control trial. And that's so important because randomized control allows us to filter out what we call confounding factors. In education, one of the most common confounding factors is the years of experience, the background, and the level of training of the teachers involved in the delivery. An intervention performed in a classroom with a brand new teacher fresh out of college is going to be inherently different than the same intervention being performed by a teacher who's been teaching for 25 or 30 years. That level of background, experience, and training influences how I deliver that intervention as a teacher. And that's what randomized control allows us to do. Instead of comparing students in a first-year teacher's classroom to students in a 30-year teacher's classroom, we're mixing them together. We have a little bit of kids from both classrooms in each group, and that allows us to see if the intervention really made a difference. Now, at the start of this video, I told you that at the end, I would share my opinions on this framework and why I don't think you should use it as your decision-making factor or copy and paste this framework into your local framework for evidence-based decision-making. So let's get into that. Here's what I think you should do instead. My primary frustration with this framework is that it presupposes that evidence-informed educators are stopping their process to peruse the evidence in order to make a decision. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about how you can make evidence review a normal and consistent part of your decision-making process. If evidence is not something special, if it's just part of how we do business in our school, then really this 4-tier framework is going to take care of itself because you're always going to have access to the best kinds of evidence to inform your decision. In order to do that effectively, I also want you to think about how you can collect evidence throughout your whole workflow and expand your mind about what that evidence is. It's not always going to be books and journal articles. Local evidence is evidence. And so if we can think about how we collect that evidence systematically, routinely throughout our workflow, again, those 4 tiers are going to take care of themselves. My other big frustration with these 4 tiers is that they presuppose that there's only one way to do really rigorous research and that experimental designs are always better than quasi-experimental designs or correlational studies or even a well-formed logic model. And that's simply not the truth. It's a vast overgeneralization. A poorly designed random controlled trial is always going to be worse than a fantastic designed quasi-experimental study. So we want to really think about the quality of each individual piece of evidence. We want to move away from these sort of 4 tiers of rigor and think about each piece of evidence as it stands on its own. And as we do that, we want to synthesize multiple pieces of evidence into new information. When we think about evidence as a standalone piece, this journal article is my evidence, we're outsourcing our information, collecting and decision-making power to someone else. We need to be synthesizing all of this information into new information that matters to us in our schools and in our local context. And you have the ability to do that. So use the framework as kind of a guide to help you think about research quality, but don't limit yourself to one tier or the other. Find evidence from all 4 of those levels and synthesize it together into new information for the best information and decisions for your school. Finally, I want you to make evidence part of a team effort. If it's always the principal or head teacher or department chair's job to evaluate evidence and bring it to the rest of the staff, that is not a sustainable process because eventually that principal, that head teacher, that department chair is going to move on. And we're going to have to start from scratch at rebuilding literacy, rebuilding evidence use practices from the ground up every time. Think about ways that you can engage your whole staff in the evidence review process and help them make the best evidence-informed decisions for their individual classrooms as well. I hope that you found value in this video today. If you did, hit subscribe and come be a part of our community of improvers. And make sure you watch some other videos on my channel before you leave today. I'll see you next time.